to AI and resilience in the age of disruption. I'm glad to have a chance to talk to you today about some of the topics that are so relevant in today's world. Also, give you a basic understanding of how AI and resilience play such a big part of the world of education. So first, a little about me. My name is Kelly Parke, and I'm the lead strategist for the Educate think tank at York University in Toronto, Canada. And basically, our mission is we're redesigning the university experience with artificial intelligence. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, and I'm going to have a case study to show you exactly what we are doing at York University. And also, I'm an adjunct professor at teaching in the MBA program at the Schulich School of Business in Toronto as well. I teach innovation, creativity, and along with technology. I'm also a technology curriculum systems consultant for Seneca College International in Toronto, Kyrgyzstan, and India, along with a private consulting business in the world of small and medium business and how you grow these types of things. Let's first of all start out with disruptive innovation. Now, I'm going to talk to you about a previous description that Clayton Christensen from Harvard came up with, and I'll just read it out to you like this. Disruption describes a process whereby a smaller company with few resources is able to successfully challenge an established incumbent business. Now, it's related to, it's good that we have a sort of a benchmark here of what the older terminology of disruption was, because we're going to relate it to the world of education and how we're going to actually have lots of disruption in our world of education, but how it plays out with the rest of society as well. There's a great opportunity here, and I'm just going to, some of the positive aspects of disruption in education, it gives us a good opportunity to redesign the model. Really think about it. As you've heard before from a few other experts in the field, we've had this model of education for hundreds and hundreds of years, a Socratic type of methodology in order to deliver educational content. Well, we're having all kinds of disruptions in the world. We're also going to be the opportunity for us to have modularization. And that's the way we're going to change some of the way we're going to have credentials, and our business model will change that way. The odds are against us to have the disruption of online classes totally replacing in-person or face-to-face classes. There's going to be some kind of combination in the future of the two of these together, not just a hybrid mode, but also this is where AI is going to creep in to help with the sort of assistive part of it, and we'll get into that a bit later. We're also going to talk about the way we change the shift of the educational delivery and the kind of things that we measure and the assessment piece. So some of the factors that are going to be changing here, there are so many more choices in the education marketplace. Now, just to show you an example here, IBM, for instance, has the Skills Academy. There are many others, but I'm just giving you a few examples here where you're going to be able to you can take courses now from these particular companies that have, done their due diligence in order to do good design work to deliver a little bit more of what the clients are asking for. Another example is LinkedIn Learning by lynda.com. They've got tens of thousands of videos of how-tos and blended them very well together to be just-in-time education for what people need. The whole key here is convenience, having the ability to study very definedly what you need when you need it. Is opening up all kinds of options. And, there are some educational institutions that are using lynda.com as ways to supplement. And you're going to see incredible partnerships between Microsoft, the parent company for lynda.com or LinkedIn Learning, and educational institutions working together. I think this is truly one of the best models, by the way, for how we're going to coexist. They've obviously found a niche. This is, the LinkedIn group and other educational institutions beyond higher ed. They've found ways to make it more convenient. They're hitting a market that we're missing. And it's not just a problem that's cropped up in the last 100 years or so, but it's even more relevant today, especially with things like social distancing, that we have many, many more online options, not just videos of how lectures were done before, but other possibilities like simulation-based learning and other situations that are well-crafted, well-designed, and have great assessment outcomes. So what's the biggest technology disruptor? Well, that's not hard to see. AI will be the most disruptive class of technologies over the next 10 years, according to Gartner's Hype Cycle for Emerging Technology. This is back in 2017, and not much has changed from that. We're looking at, from PricewaterhouseCoopers, estimates that productivity gains will add another $15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030. This is by no means an outlandish figure. This is actually quite conservative. The impact of AI will economically change how things are driven, not just how things are done, but it will drive a lot of the world's economy. And not in that economy, related to jobs as well, because we're in the fourth industrial revolution right now, and we're looking at blurring the lines between technology world and what it means to be human. So this is where it's very, very important that we understand from a human-centered design point of view how AI will be impactful, not just because we can do it through technology it's possible, but how we design it from a human-centered point of view. It has to be able to mesh in with what we desire as human beings. And we've got a long history with this. And just to give you some of the economic and job impact, second stat there, nearly 50% of companies will expect that automation will lead to a reduction in full-time workforce, which means not just the kinds of jobs, but the actual workforce that's required for a lot of these things will change. And not just for higher-end computing. Very basic manual jobs will change. White-collar jobs will change. Blue-collar jobs will change. It will be across the board. So you have to really think and position yourself into the relevance of this. I know a lot of you already understand how much AI will change the job market, but it will be across the board. So we have to think of this as getting comfortable with not only the change, but what the new reality of this change will bring and how we position ourselves. And it's going to be massive. Some basic strategies for surviving the AI disruption that's going to happen. First thing that's happened, especially we looked earlier at two companies that were providing educational alternatives, we have to identify the strengths. These are basic things of disruption. You have to identify the strengths of your disruptor's business model. What are making these other entrants into the educational world successful? Why are they doing it? And so if we understand some of the gaps that they're filling in, it'll help us in the educational or higher ed world get used to what we are missing in our business model. There are options out there for people. And so that's, again, why we have to identify our relative advantages. We also have to evaluate the conditions, and the conditions are going to change dynamically. So it's not just we can just examine the conditions once. We actually have to keep an eye on it. And I think we really need to have to consider a sustaining approach to innovation to develop these type of insights or have that open-mindedness. The very first thing that people run into, which is quite difficult at the beginning, is a true definition of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is actually three terms. They're all AI, believe it or not. The first being assistive intelligence, and we've seen that quite a bit in the last, say, 10 years, where we have things like Siri, or we have things like Alexa popping up. And this is where we have assisted intelligence. It's machines empowering us to execute actions. The objective is more about improving operational efficiency. The second state is augmented intelligence. And this is where it's very important for us in the education world. We're actually doing more and more of this type of AI work of augmenting intelligence. It's a man-machine or human-machine collaboration on the decision-making. Super important for us because we actually are able to have a relationship and work with the technology a lot closer. And it's not like we're having the machines making a lot of the decisions for us. It's in a collaboration. It's giving us information or giving us insight through technology to make better human decisions. So the world of education, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on. Augmented intelligence is something that we are really in this sort of major development cycle of right now. We're in that sort of crest where augmentation of human capability is at the forefront. And I'll talk about this later. When we get to the autonomous intelligence, the third level, this is where machines are making the decisions without direction from human involvement. It's going to become important, like for instance, NASDAQ is using it already. Autonomous cars are a sign of that. It has to get to that level, to that point of autonomous intelligence in order for the machines to make decisions themselves. And this will come in a much greater degree than it is right now. But I think that most people think that this is the era that we're living in right now, but we're not quite there to where we're having full autonomous capability from machines. Something we need to do a lot of looking at ethics and looking at different ways of how that happens before we get there. So personally, I'm glad we have a little bit of time before we have reached this full autonomous stage, but that's sort of the third level of AI. Let me just go back a little bit in history. How long do you think human beings have been thinking about artificial intelligence? I'll give you a second to think about that. It's a lot of people have been thinking that it's only in recent history. But as far as recorded history, if we look back to the time of Aristotle, like 300 BC, there was mechanical thought. And he describes his methodology as a matter of fact, some of the basic logic from the digital world that we live in now was thought about by Aristotle back in 300 BC. Let's jump all the way to 1864. And Samuel Butler, interesting, he suggests that the Darwinian evolution also applies to machines, and speculates that one day conscious and eventually they'll become conscious and supplant humanity. It's interesting. It sounds like some of our science fiction movies that we've watched over the last 50 years or so. But all the way back in 1864, Samuel Butler had these thoughts that would be possible if we could create something that had consciousness. And so that was a sort of a human desire. We jump forward to 1980. This is 40 years ago. The first national conference happened for artificial intelligence. It was happened at Stanford. 2005. So this is where we have robots actually being able to act like humans, mimicking walking, hand movements, able to deliver interesting trays to customers. Not too practical in a sense, but being much more human. The desire to have AI and robotics combined together to create a humanoid type form. Little playful as it was, this was sort of a forerunner to start to having a practical use of AI in this human type form. One of the watershed moments for AI was the game of Jeopardy! It's a TV game show. In 2011, Watson, the IBM computing system, defeated contestants on Jeopardy. Up till then, people weren't thinking that there's no way that machines can think like humans. So to answer questions that were posed on Jeopardy was basically deconstructing and reforming the question was too complex. That was a human type of capability. But this event in 2011 showed that it was possible for a machine to be able to do this. And that was a pretty significant moment. We get to 2018, we try a different type of language test. Alibaba used its language processing to outscore humans at the Stanford Reading and Comprehension Test. So it wasn't just about crunching numbers and data, it was having the ability to understand and comprehend structures, sentences, feelings. We're getting into the era where the machines are starting to be able to read not only intent and language, but emotion within the text, and also emotion within the audio, emotion within the facial movement that's going on. So the machines are starting to become much more complex in understanding human beings. We've reached this point now where the human adaptability, the AQ portion, has risen to the point where technology has surpassed it. So our ability to now do technology pieces is going much more rapidly than a human has the ability to adapt to change. And that's one of the things that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about later is human adaptability to change, or AQ. I'm also going to briefly talk to you about Watson to give you an example of IBM's technology. And so one of the things that we're finding, I'm just going to stop for a second and talk to you about some of the challenges that we're facing, is that it's not just about having everything digitized. There's a lot of data that exists in the world pre-digital, the analog world, up to the digital era, that's considered dark data. The information that human beings can understand, but machines can't. So that's the current challenge right now in the world, is basically having a language that machines can understand to understand human beings. And I mean that by the data of information and things around it. So that's the biggest challenge right now. And as you'll see in the case study that I'm going to talk about, understanding the dark data portion of the world in order to make machines more comprehensive like human beings. That is a huge challenge. Although, when you look at it, the capability of machines to take in information, for instance, the Watson ingest engine can handle 500 gigabytes of information per second, or the equivalent of 1 million books per second. That's a lot of information being digitized. It's going to bring me to augmented intelligence or cognitive computing. Not to replace human beings, it's about helping humans become faster and smarter. This is where we get into the augmentation piece of intelligence. That's what the cognitive computing is about. It helps make sense of big data, big analytics, and simulations. And through the use of cognitive computing, we can actually have human thought processes can be simulated. So that's one of the pieces that was missing early on, was the ability to think like a human being and how it could interconnect or interrelate different parts of the brain, how the neural paths worked. So this is where augmented intelligence sort of does best. It's when it can relate things to simulate how a human being works. And so like the saying says, that the most revolutionary thing about augmented intelligence is the possibility of solving some of the world's biggest problems. This is where it's going to help humanity. So just to give you an idea of, this is according to the World Economic Forum, some abilities that we're going to have in healthcare, it's going to make driving safer by assisting human beings. It's going to transform, and this is where in the education world that we sort of live in is the transforming how we learn, when we learn, where we learn. All that will change through AI. It's going to help us with energy, and it's also going to help wildlife so that we can be more aware of things as they're happening rather than after the fact. So it'll make us hyper aware of our planet. And so I like to say this, that augmented intelligence is like a curious toddler. We're at a very early stage where it's exploring and we're having to feed it lots of information and to teach it. The only difference is that the toddler can get its PhD in a few weeks. It can handle much more rapidly. But in some ways, I kind of look at this period as the early stages of development where we have it learning and sometimes making mistakes, but working its way around just kind of like a human toddler. I'm going to give you one of the sort of key aspects I'm finding with designing these systems. And I talk about designing AI from a human-centered approach because there are obviously data scientists. I work with data scientists a lot to do the physical mechanics of designing AI systems. But there has to be a much larger front-end human development engine that's involved. So as educators, this is something you have to factor in, that you may not be able to do all the hard-coded programming, do a lot of the data science work for analytics. But what you can do is some of the best design work. And this absolutely, I'm finding, is even more critical than the data science, is having things sorted out. So I said one of the key things is actually understanding the problem you're going to solve. I know it sounds very, very simple, but there's a huge grain of truth in all of this, that you need to understand to a very high degree the problem you're going to solve, not just from your point of view, but from all of the stakeholders of your situation. For instance, your students, your administration, your government, yourself as a teacher, perhaps. Understanding the design of how this works and how it could benefit you and all of these stakeholders simultaneously is one of the keys in designing great AI or a great AI application. Every job to be done can be solved. What we lack is a clearly defined problems that are driven from all of the stakeholders. That is one of the keys to problem solving and designing AI, understanding that problem. So the other thing when you have multiple stakeholders involved is that you have multiple ways of looking at the problem. And this is going to lead to some insights that seem unimaginable. And this is where it leads to my second point of adaptability quotient, or AQ. AQ is emerging as in today's society as the pace of change increases. So what we're seeing is a person's ability to adapt to change rapidly, given new sets of circumstances and things to solve. That we're finding is a critical new skill. To define it a little bit better, we look at it like if you take your IQ along with your EQ or your emotional intelligence, you're going to get your adaptability. Logic and reason combined leads to adaptability. The importance of AQ will outpace IQ and EQ in the future. Another term for adaptability quotient is resilience. This is your ability to change. Resilience has been around for millions of years in nature. It's obvious, and we could look at Darwin's theory of natural selection uses survival of the fittest. Adaptive quotient is a measure of an individuals or companies or countries or even a species' ability to survive and change. So this is a fairly general thing, but we can apply it to our problem solving. So what are some of the forces that are driving the need for resilience today? Obviously, the growth of the gig economy, specifically amongst millennials. The rise of AI and automation and machine learning, mental health, awareness, and shattering the stigma around that, and the acknowledgement of different skill sets are required for work today. So as educators, we train somebody to be specific, like an engineer in a particular field. But along with those skills need to be a set of adaptability skills, not only to take problems on and solve them, but to take in multiple stakeholders at the same time to help design solutions, not just the right answer, but the right answer to multiple stakeholders or people that are involved in the decision. I'm going to quote Louis Pasteur here. Chance favors only the prepared mind. Sudden flashes of insight don't happen, but are the product of preparation. Being prepared or having the conditions for innovation to happen is key for us to be able to do this. This is where we have to create the conditions for innovation to happen. And creating them in education. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Mr. Leonardo da Vinci and his abilities. The Italian Renaissance that happened during the period of his lifetime was an unusual historical time of innovation. And a lot of people have looked over that period and tried to assess why was there so much innovation happening? What caused these things to happen? And I'm going to quote Franz Johansson here, that it's really the Medici effect. And the Medicis were wealthy bankers in Florence, Italy, during the Renaissance period, and they had lots of wealth. And back then, when you had lots of wealth, there wasn't a lot of things you couldn't buy, but you could commission or you could have become a patron to the arts. So people like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and these people flourished during this period because they were brought together in a situation where they learned a lot from each other. This coming together of experimental minds and artists and poets in one sort of place and time and influencing each other created the conditions for the Renaissance to happen. A huge outpouring of innovation in engineering, art, and other kinds of things were going on. And Da Vinci was one of the greatest minds that used all of these capabilities in these conditions. So I'm just going to give you the 7 Da Vincian principles here, and you could see how his different geniuses would come out. Number 1, curiosity, an unrelenting quest for continuous learning, a commitment to test knowledge. Continual refinement of the senses was also key. He had a willingness to embrace ambiguity. That's something that doesn't happen often enough now. Whole brain thinking, development between balance of art and science and logic and imagination, which seem to be very different kinds of ways of thinking, but combining the two of them together, balancing the body, mind, and spirit, a recognition of and appreciation for the interconnectedness of all things and phenomena. This is called systems thinking. These are the 7 Da Vincian principles that Leonardo had, and because of the conditions of the time, was allowed to sort of experiment with a lot of these things and grow them even further. And so I'm going to quote Kevin Kelly here. A bigger payoff will come when we start inventing new kinds of intelligences and entirely new ways of thinking. I'm going to go through a quick case study of how we apply AI and resilience to a project we're working on right now called the Perpetual Course at York University. The beginning stages of the Perpetual Course happen like all good design. We sat and designed for a couple of months looking at all of the stakeholders that were involved in the educational system. The problem was we needed to reimagine what the educational system would look like in the future. So we sat down with the design team. We met all of the stakeholders one by one. We thoroughly examined some of their needs, and we went through and we designed lots of possibilities on the understanding of what success would look like to them, what some of the relations were, what some of the problems were. And we spent a long time really defining the problem. As I've said before, problem solving and defining the problem is one of the key elements to designing great AI, and great AI in education is understanding the problems that you're dealing with. From that point, we sketched out a workflow. We had some limitations. We had design parameters we had to fall under. Certain tools we had to use. Certain other tools were possibilities. And we started sketching out possible data flows that would work. In this particular project, we were working with the IBM Watson team. We decided that we would come up with, in order to prove the concept out before we did any deeper design, we built what's considered to be a first attempt at a prototype, and we called it a dashboard. One of the things we identified early on was that we had to, keeping with augmenting intelligence, we had to be able to produce something that would assist a professor to understand their students better, because one of the greatest challenges we had was there was more students to professor ratio. Every professor wanted to spend more individual time with each student. And we thought, okay, well, maybe one of the things we could do is have a chatbot handle some of the frequently asked questions that could take some of the workload off the professor. The professor could get to the part where they enjoyed the most and was the most benefit and had the best use of their knowledge, was giving more one-to-one direction to students once we got past the basic information that had to be relayed. So we came up with the concept of the first revelation or reveal would be a professor dashboard to get to know students better than previously had known, but we're also measuring and assessing things that weren't commonly measured before. And the way we had to do that was we had to integrate it with our learning management system. And that was going to be our data point through. So this was an initial prototype dashboard of what the console would look like when it was brought up to the professor to help see how a student was progressing through the system. And so it was decided on the particular workflow. We're using an LMS called Moodle. Some other people use Canvas or Blackboard. Our particular one at York University with this client was Moodle, and we were going to use that as the origination point for data. It was going to move to object storage using Jupyter, and then we're going to use natural language processing. One of the key elements we found with this process was that it had to work with the narrative. It's not just a matter of designing this to work with scores and calculation on statistics. It had to work with natural language processing and natural language understanding. So two different pieces. So the input, for instance, in some of the learning management systems were narrative. So the student would write a couple of paragraphs or write a couple of pages of work. The AI would be able to strip through it and be able to process to see whether they had an understanding of the concepts. We had to program some of the concepts in that we were looking for, but the machines are understanding more and more how I, for instance, if I was a professor, how it would mark my work based on that. So in essence, we were teaching the systems at the beginning of how to become a teaching assistant or somebody to help a prof that would have the basic understanding of what the professor wanted and then give feedback, but using natural language. And it showed sentiment analysis, it showed tone, and these were the sort of core components as part of the design. Because what we identified early on in some of the conversations with the profs is that they wanted to be able to get sort of a second opinion or an assessment of a student based on the writings that were done. So that was the goal here. Anyway, this was the particular technical methodology, the process that was going to be used. This is how the natural language understanding looked when we started processing it through different students and how many posts that they made and were some of the key and major themes. So now we started to have real data to work with. But it also revealed some of the systems design work that we had to do. This was a pilot. This was something that had to, we launched, and we were more curious to understand what some of the processing was versus getting the right answer from the very beginning. We wanted to see how students would react to this being put out there. So what we realized was that we had to build much, much more data points. So one of the key learnings we have, and this project's still in progress, but one of the key learnings we had from all of this was we did not build enough data points that were rich enough in the kinds of information we needed in order to get in-depth analysis from the students. So that's one of the things we're revisiting, is how to ask the right question. And so that's a key element to any kind of management, but you really have to be able to, and it works in this case with AI as well, you have to be able to go through and understand the right question to elicit a response that's going to be rich enough in data to get a true understanding. So that's sort of one of the lessons learned from this particular case study, is that we have to build in better, not just more data points, because that just gives us, statistical information, but elicit better responses, more rich responses, so that we can get a little bit more in depth in the analysis. What we're hoping to get is to go back to that professor dashboard, and we're going to start to be able to read students at an emotional level, we're going to look at and be able to measure their empathy, for instance, their mastery of the topic. More than just statistical, we want to go a lot deeper. And the way we're going to do that is through asking better questions and having better data points set up. So that's kind of the outcome of this. Let me look at the strategy here and I'm just going to sort of sum things up for you. The strategy for surviving artificial intelligence in education. Number one, develop an understanding of what can and what cannot, what AI can do and cannot do, and which particular type you're dealing with at the moment. Remember the three types of intelligence you're dealing with. Are you dealing with an assisted intelligence, which is now widely available? Improves what people are doing? Are you in the phase of augmented intelligence? Or do you really want to go to the autonomous intelligence stage where you're going to be able to develop stuff for the future? When we have a chance to meet online later in May, we're going to have a chance to work on the practical side of how we do a design for AI in education. Take you back to some of the rudimentary things that you have to do in order to not only just quickly release something in AI, or I use an AI component, but define why you need it, where you need it, how will it benefit people. There's lots of questions that you're going to be able to generate and answer that are critical in order to use AI in education. What we're heading towards is personalized education, meeting many more needs. Besides setting a standard of education, we're going to be able to tailor the education to more needs, understand our students a little bit better, to be able to work with these students on a more one-to-one basis to give them the individual attention they're going to need. Also, what it will do is it'll help us become better teachers by giving us a second opinion on some of the work we're doing. And it's going to give us the ability to have consistency when we're basically having large classes in order to give everybody more help than we can physically possibly do at this moment with just the way we've been doing things. This is going to expand our capabilities greatly. And I look forward to seeing you in May.